One thing I noticed when I thought about whether to make this video is that whilst I'd be more than happy to point out most of the glaring issues in the secular community, I've not once done a video specifically on sexual harassment. I've mentioned it, talked about it on social media and linked to the work of others, but haven't really sat down to respond to it in my own way. And I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that the last time I made such a video, I was effectively forced to leave the community I've been part of for the last 3 years. But since I finally decided it was time to share my experiences on that in a video I've been working on these past few weeks, relating to another YouTube community and their response to this sort of thing, I felt I could finally go ahead and change that. There's also the fact that a portion of the secular community has already attempted to drive me out of said community for, and get this, having the audacity to stand up to a violent transphobe and their defenders. So, by this point, it's kind of like, what are they going to do that I haven't already faced? So for those of you unaware, the Anti-Theism International Convention 2020 is an event that will be taking place in the UK, to which accused sexual harasser and decade-long Jeffrey Epstein apologist Lawrence Krauss is a key speaker. Now, if that isn't enough red flags for you, one of the key organisers is also John Richards, the publications director of Atheist Alliance International. Full disclosure, until recently I used to work under John Richards as part of the Atheist Alliance International team. Myself and Adita had been brought on by a close friend in an effort to try and curtail the adoption of far-right fear-mongering into the secular community. However, we resigned from our positions when AAI went ahead and created a new position to install David Silverman, another figure with multiple sexual harassment claims against him, into said position. Returning to the convention, and for the most part the secular community has just accepted this fact. Key figures such as Richard Dawkins, Ayn Mariam Namazi and the Cosmic Skeptic see no problem with throwing their support behind an event riddled with men who have a problematic history. And that's putting it nicely. Things all changed, however, when another organiser by the name of Lance Gregorchuk did a podcast interview in which they not only partook in blatant sexual harassment apologia, but went ahead and joked about sexually assaulting the host were he to attend. Thankfully, this crossed the line, even with many of those who had until recently been happy to ignore the problem at large. Ayn Mariam Namazi and a few others have begun pulling out of the conference, and conversation has finally turned to what the conference, which, reminder, hosts a known child rape apologist, is doing to ensure everyone's safety. Just so you know, Epstein had already pleaded guilty to various acts of sexual misconduct with minors by the time Krauss defended him in 2011.
I'm speaking, of course, about Lawrence Krauss. 8 years ago, when the Epstein sentencing was heavily in the news, a skeptic reader sent us an alarming quote from Lawrence Krauss, a man who previously we all admired. He had appeared on my old podcast, and, we wouldn't expect this of him. And yet, Krauss was quoted defending Epstein, who had just been convicted of, again, soliciting sex from an underage girl, by saying that he had never seen Epstein rape a minor. And Krauss is a scientist, so he knows what's right. The two of them were friends, and Epstein gave a lot of money to Krauss for various projects. We thought there's no way, despite their supposed friendship and how much money Epstein has given Krauss, there's no way he would have actually said something so boneheaded. So rather than just run the story, I contacted Lawrence Krauss and asked for context. And he gave me that context, which was essentially, yep, bitches be lying, in a barely literate screed that he insisted I publish in full. He claimed that Epstein was the actual victim here, and that the teenage girls he raped actually took advantage of him, and that they then made false accusations to get his money. When I published all of his statements, Krauss went on to quadruple down and jumped into the comments on the post, pointing out that even if Epstein did rape those kids, Krauss knows for a fact he came out of prison a more thoughtful and responsible man who was intent on doing good. And that, I swear to God he saed this, If the famous physicist Richard Feynman were still alive today, he would also agree with Lawrence Krauss. Fucking yikes.
So whether or not Krauss has actually done anything inappropriate himself is really irrelevant. His articles defending Epstein should have been enough to have him disinvited from all future secular events. Now, since the issue blew up, John Richards informs us that Gregor Chuck has been fired from his position, which is great. It's a start, at least. However, Richards couldn't help himself but start digging a hole, claiming that even though it continues to host Lawrence Krauss, a known child rape apologist, the conversation surrounding the conference should not be derailed by the question on everyone's mind. This information comes from Stephanie Zvan, a writer of The Orbit, a group which is currently fighting off a slap suit by Dr. Richard Carrier for reporting on his apparent sexual misconduct. Stephanie had an interaction with Richards in public which is genuinely terrifying to read. He opens up with a classic, "I have 2 daughters," before going on to state that he doesn't want them to, quote, "think they can get away with making false accusations in future," end quote. Breathing life into this myth that there are people out there, specifically women, going around and lying about sexual misconduct for nefarious reasons. Coming out and standing up to your abuser or predator is not fun. I experienced that as a minor in a different community, but there are no end to the number of women who have had their character dragged through the mud for daring to warn others in a secular community about specific men. Hell, a woman can't even offer men some advice, some general goddamn advice, without being harassed by the majority of the community. It is not this fun experience. It's incredibly disempowering. But when you've been through sexual harassment or assault, you can feel like dragging yourself through hell is worth it if there's even a chance that it will stop the same thing happening to someone else. To go back to my case, I left it for a year and only spoke out after I discovered a school friend of mine who I'd introduced to the community had also been targeted by this person. Because I realised it didn't stop with me when I severed all contact with them. Richards also went on to state that, quote, "Thirdly, I do not want the Anti-Theism Convention to be taken over by issues associated with the current social turbulence regarding what should be considered to be appropriate sexual behaviour for the 21st century." End quote. Except here's the thing. If we were looking at a religious institution such as the Catholic Church and they said the exact same thing, saying that a religion of God shouldn't be taken over by issues associated with the current social turbulence regarding what should be considered to be appropriate sexual behaviour for the 21st century, how would we respond to that? Better yet, how should we respond to that? A fact Richards himself goes on to undermine later, stating, quote, "I believe we need to challenge the undeserved respect and control traditionally given to religious authorities who do not sufficiently disapprove of the mutilization of newborn sexual organs, the sexual and physical abuse of children, the demonization of homosexuals, the subjugation of women, the martyrdom given to radicalized terrorists, and the deception perpetrated on the population at large that there is a better afterlife to go to upon death." End quote. I can't be the only one to see the hypocrisy there with that bit about children and child sexual assault, whilst one of the key people you are hosting is Lawrence Krauss, a well-known and publicized child rape apologist. Now, another thing we see throughout the interaction are a lot of mentions of justice and due process. This is a very popular go-to for those seeking to pretend like we have to sit on our hands until someone finally gets the courage to take their abuser to court. However, it forgets one very important thing. The evidence required to convict someone in court and the evidence required to act in public are two very different things. When someone tells you that someone assaulted them and you have no reason to distrust that, that is enough evidence to act on. You don't pull out a chair, call a mock jury and hold a trial. Not if you're a reasonable human being. That's whether it be putting distance between the person and yourself and others or disinviting them from an event. Why? Well, put simply, prison is an act of violence. It's an institution that, as it currently stands, strips people of many of their freedoms. However, it's a justified act of violence, or at least should be. And the way we justify said violence, in theory, is through the court of law. Do you know what isn't violence? Disinviting a speaker or simply not creating positions to hand them power over others on a silver fucking platter. That's how we end up in situations where people feel secure enough to boast publicly, on live air being recorded about how they've taken part in sexual harassment, attempting to get others to validate their statements, because they feel immune to social accountability. This sort of shit has been normalised as just another part of the secular community. And whilst we've seen some sort of repercussion in this instance, this is the exception and should not be taken as a sign of a general resolution to the problem at whole. The conference is still hosting a known child rape apologist, and no one is flipping their shit as they should be. So the people pulling out aren't doing so because they don't want to be associated with a community that neglects the victims of sexual harassment, because that ship has already sailed. They're pulling out because said community standard has only become so overt in this instance that they can't turn a blind eye and be disassociated in that way. And I'm fucking sick of it. I am sick of this bury our heads in the sand sort of mentality when it comes to sexual harassment, transphobia, racism, and a load of other shit too numerous to mention. If we don't start acting sooner, eventually these are going to be the faces our community is associated with. Anytime we raise a genuine issue, all people are going to do is point to the fact that we can't even keep our own community secure. The question we are facing right now is, do we want that? So those are my thoughts. As always, please check out our other videos. You can also support Essence of Thought via Patreon, and in doing so, help us become ad-free. We'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone who's already given to the channel, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Muk Gay, Steve Corbin, Valentin Marcus, Atlas5, and Sash Daniels. And for myself and Adita, take care now.